part of all of these amazing events that we have going on. So tonight is the 30th anniversary of the Loma Prieta earthquake. We've also been having quite a few earthquakes this week, so something's in the air. So we're really excited to explore this topic today, not just from the cultural perspective of how it's affected Santa Cruz, but also the geologic perspective. We're also very lucky to have Heather from UCSC from the seismology lab back there. Thanks for being here, Heather. She's an amazing resource and has some really wonderful demos. So after this lecture, she's going to be sticking around also with Gavin. If any of you have been here for our Rockin' Pop-Ups, it's every fourth Saturday of the month in the morning. We have two geologists, Gavin and Graham, here to talk rocks with you. And Gavin's going to be here tonight and a little bit too. So they'll be able to answer your geologic questions about earthquakes. We also have Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to wave? Hello, Kathleen is our collections manager, and she has a table exploring the Loma Prieta earthquake through some of our collections items. And we also have a special exhibit right now that's called A Sense of Scale, which explores Loma Prieta. It also explores how we perceive earthquakes. We have some items that belonged to Charles Richter of the Richter scale on display here, and those are on loan from the seismology lab where Heather works. So just wanted to make sure you know everything we have going on tonight. But tonight, what we're really here for is Frank Perry. So Frank Perry is our speaker tonight, and he's also a dear friend of the museum. I believe that Frank started volunteering for the museum when he was 16.
About that.
Around 16 years old. So he's been helping us out for a long time, both as a volunteer and staff and advisor. Now he spends most of his time with the Capitola Historical Museum, and so if you have not been there, you should definitely go check it out. He does an amazing job there. Frank is also one of the recipients of the museum's Laura Heacock's Naturalist Award, which is something that we give to members of our community who embody the spirit of our founder, Laura Heacock, and how she championed curiosity of nature and stewardship of nature. And so that's one of the reasons why we love bringing Frank back. And so please join me in giving Frank a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much to the Marisa and the museum for inviting me here. You might turn that down a little bit.
Keep talking.
They're getting more and more high tech around here. I told her, another few years they're going to have an engineer in the back running all the sound engineer. But anyway, it's great to be here and great to have such a big audience this evening, and including my little granddaughter who's right up here up front, and as well as my two, Cheryl Ross. We're not sure whether she's a future astrophysicist or future paleontologist or just what, but something along those lines. How many here experienced and remember the Loma Prieta earthquake? Oh, lots of you. Okay, great. Well, we're going to save a little time at the end for people to share some stories. So I hope some of you will speak up, and if you have an especially good earthquake story, that you will share it later on. This is this evening sort of my take on local geology and earthquakes. And so I've tried to gather together information that I think is important to know, as well as interesting. And so I hope you will enjoy it. So earthquakes around here, and the true earthquakes, are caused by rocks moving in the Earth's crust, usually along faults. There are other things that can shake the Earth's crust, like volcanoes and geysers and landslides and large explosions. But I was just talking to Heather earlier, and she says that these days they technically don't call those earthquakes, so those don't count. But they do count, of course, if you're feeling them. The Santa Cruz Mountains are very young geologically. They formed over the past few million years. And because we're on such an active area geologically is why we have earthquakes. About 2 months before the Loma Prieta earthquake, my wife and I, both of us have degrees in geology, my wife's father was visiting and he had an airplane. And so we said, well, could you fly us over the San Andreas Fault? So in August of '89, we flew the San Andreas Fault from down south of Hollister up through the Watsonville area. And it was really interesting to see firsthand some of the features that we had read about. There's an offset stream in one place, and landslides, sag ponds, various features associated with faulting. So as I said, the Santa Cruz Mountains are very young geologically. In fact, as recently as 2 or 3 million years ago, the mountains weren't here. This area was all underwater. And the ocean not only extended across this area, but there was an arm of the sea that extended clear into the San Joaquin Valley of California. Some of the fossils that are found here are the same kinds of fossils that are found over near Coalinga and over near Bakersfield. Up in the mountains here, you can find lots of marine fossils that are evidence that this was once under the sea. These are fossil sand dollars, so we know it was definitely under the ocean because sand dollars and sea urchins and other kinds of echinoderms, that's a group of animals that is entirely, and always has been, entirely marine. There aren't any freshwater forms. As many of you probably know, the Earth's crust is divided into tectonic plates. The yellow there is the Pacific plate. The brown up above is the North American plate. And where we are here in Central California, those two plates are sliding past each other. And the area where they slide is the San Andreas Fault. This is a diagram that the U.S. Geological Survey did a few weeks or a month after the earthquake. And it shows the Pacific plate on the left in red and the North American plate on the right. And the San Andreas Fault going in that red line there. There are quite a few different kinds of faults, and this diagram, also by the U.S. Geological Survey, is a pretty good diagram at showing some of the basic kinds of fault movement. On the far right is what's called a strike-slip fault, and that's a fault that moves mostly horizontally. In the middle is what's called a normal fault, and that has vertical, or what's called dip-slip movement along the fault plane. And on the far left is what's called a reverse fault, also a vertical or dip-slip movement. Had the fault plane been at less than a 45-degree angle, then the one on the left would be called a thrust fault, so called because the rock is being thrust over on top of the other rock. Well, of course, nature is always more complicated than we would like. And in the case of the Loma Prieta earthquake, there wasn't strictly vertical or horizontal movement. It was a combination of the two. And here you can see down in the lower left corner, the fault moved up 4.3 feet, and it moved north 6.2 feet for a total distance of 7.5 feet. So sort of an oblique movement. Now faults come in all sizes. They have the San Andreas that has moved hundreds of miles. Some faults, like the ones on the table out there, have only moved a few millimeters. This is a fossil whale bone that I uncovered many years ago, and it's been offset by a fault. Fault runs right through the bone. I think you can see where the fault is going diagonally across there, and it's been offset about 2 or 3 inches. So really fun to find something like that in nature. Here in Santa Cruz County, there are 5 major faults. Some of which are active and some of which are not. An active fault is one that has moved at least once in the past 10,000 years. Across the top there is, of course, the one we've all heard about, the San Andreas Fault, and the Loma Prieta earthquake occurred on the San Andreas Fault. They're going off this way. One side there is the Butno Fault, which is a branch of the San Andreas Fault. And then down a little bit lower, you see the Zayante Fault. So those are also major faults in Santa Cruz County. The problem is that they are in mountainous, heavily vegetated areas, so nobody's been able to get a really good look at the rocks there or dig trenches across to see if they are active. So simply not much data on those faults. The Ben Lomond Fault runs right down the San Lorenzo Valley and underneath the city of Santa Cruz. Fortunately, we do have data on that one, and it is not active. It hasn't moved in at least 80 to 100,000 years, and really most of its movement, which was several thousand feet, was millions of years ago. There's a 5th fault, which just barely kind of rubs against the edge of Santa Cruz County up on the north coast, called the San Gregorio Fault. It's a very long fault, runs across Monterey Bay and offshore off of Monterey and San Luis Obispo counties, and also all the way up to Point Reyes. And that is also an active fault. There was a study done about 20 years ago, and they found evidence that it had generated around a 7.1 magnitude earthquake hundreds of years ago. Then there's one more fault that we need to talk about that is very important for this area, and that's the Hayward Fault that runs along the East Bay foothills and also the hills east of the Santa Clara Valley, and that's capable of producing a major earthquake. Produced a big one in the 1860s. And certainly that it could produce an earthquake that would be felt quite strongly here in Santa Cruz County. So there's the magnitude of an earthquake. We all heard about earthquake magnitudes. Is determined by measuring the amplitude of on the recording of a seismograph. It's a scale that was first set up by Mr. Richter back in the 1930s. And there are 2 things that are important to remember about the earthquake magnitude. And one of them is that the measurement takes into account the distance the seismograph is from the epicenter of the earthquake. So whether it's 100 miles away or 500 miles away, if things are working right, they should get the same calculation for the magnitude of the earthquake. The other thing to keep in mind is that the earthquake scale is a logarithmic scale. So a magnitude 4 earthquake is not twice as strong as a magnitude 2. A magnitude 3 is 10 times as strong as a magnitude 2. A magnitude 4 would be 100 times stronger than a magnitude 2, and a magnitude 5 would be 1,000 times. So that's the important thing. Another important thing to keep in mind. So don't confuse that with the intensity scale. So one was the magnitude scale, but the intensity scale is the intensity of the earthquake in a specific area, how people feel it and how much damage is done. So here in Central California, the Loma Prieta earthquake in Santa Cruz County was an intensity ranging from about 6 to 8. And in some places at the epicenter, probably even more than 8. And you can see 8, it says damage slight in specially designed structures, considerable damage in ordinary substantial buildings with partial collapse, damage great in poorly built structures, fall of chimneys, factory stacks, columns, monuments, walls, heavy furniture overturned. And that pretty much sums it up for Santa Cruz 30 years ago. And this is an intensity scale for the Loma Prieta earthquake. You can see 8 for a good part of Santa Cruz County, and then farther away 7 and 6 and 5 and so forth. These kind of setups are great when you're looking at really old earthquakes, say from the 1800s, where there weren't seismographs or didn't have a Richter magnitude scale. One could go through old newspaper accounts, which were often very, very detailed, and then from that construct a map like this and get some idea of the magnitude and location of the epicenter. Now, with the intensity scale, you would think, well, the farther away you are from the origin of the earthquake, the weaker the intensity. But there are some exceptions to that, because earthquake waves travel differently through different kinds of rock. And they travel more slowly through softer rock and unconsolidated sediments, and therefore there's more shaking where you have those kinds of substrates. This is a map showing the East Bay and the Loma Prieta earthquake, and it shows the seismograph results on bedrock, bay mud, and sand and gravel. And the greatest shaking was where there was bay mud. Unfortunately, part of the Highway 880, these double-decker freeway up there, was on that bay mud, and that was the part that collapsed, and there were the most fatalities during the earthquake. And there was a similar result in this county. This is where Highway 1 crossed Struve Slough in Watsonville. And right in Santa Cruz, we could see the difference between different substrates. Shaking right in downtown was more severe than up here. We're on what's called the First Marine Terrace, which is mostly sandstone as opposed to the old river sediments in downtown. This is down near Myrtle Street in Santa Cruz, where shaking was severe enough to knock a lot of old houses off their foundations. The ground actually buckled on Laurel Street. And you think about it, that area is very near Erie Lagoon, and where there's old marshy ground if you probably dig down a ways. The Loma Prieta earthquake was very, very extensively studied. The day after the quake, seismologists and seismology students and geologists from all over the western United States flocked to this area to conduct various studies. And the results of those studies were published over the next 5, 10, 15 years by different societies and government agencies. This bulletin of the Seismological Society of America is a special issue. It's 800 pages long. So if you want to do some more reading about the earthquake, there's lots of information out there. I thought it'd be good to just do a quick rundown of the 7 major earthquakes that we've had in Santa Cruz County since the 1850s. The first one on that list is one from 1857, and this was a magnitude similar to the 1906 earthquake, 7.9 it's estimated, but was more to the south. In Santa Cruz, it's mainly known for destroying the front of the old adobe mission chapel up on Mission Hill. Now they were having a lot of earthquakes back then. So that was 1857. So just a few years later, in 1865, there was an earthquake very similar to the Loma Prieta earthquake, probably the same section of the San Andreas Fault. Here's a little description of it from the Sentinel. They wrote differently back then. It was an earthquake, see if I can even read these words. It was an earthquake of no ordinary power or operation, but a regular stubborn twisted affair, gain twist at that, shot off from the bowels of the earth or old Neptune's domain to settle our dinner or regulate terrestrial affairs, which in this sublunary sphere has been somewhat out of joint the past few years. I assume the last part of the sentence refers to the Civil War. That's my translation. Well, only 3 years after that, in 1868, there was a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault. So Santa Cruz, San Francisco Bay Area had been taking quite a beating from earthquakes there. 3 major quakes in only 11 years. This article says, at exactly 5 minutes before 8 o'clock Wednesday morning, San Francisco time, see they didn't have standard time yet, Santa Cruz was visited by an earthquake, only second to the one of October 8th, 1865. The shock lasted from 30 to 40 seconds, so that's quite a bit longer than Loma Prieta, and the vibration was northeast to southwest. And so if it's coming down from the Hayward area, that makes sense. The shock has been followed up with lighter ones, what we would call aftershock. So this is only a little paragraph, but it has a lot of valuable information in it. Of course, the really big one was the 1906 earthquake. The San Andreas Fault ruptured for a distance of 296 miles, 7.9. Scary when you think about it. This is the county courthouse, built in 1895, badly damaged in 1906 in Santa Cruz, and then of course damaged again similarly in 1989. At that point it was demolished. My mother used to talk about this one. She was about 8 years old in 1926. Double earthquakes. Originated out in Monterey Bay, probably around 6.1 to 6.3. So it's 4:35 in the morning, you're sound asleep, and there's this big earthquake that wakes you up, breaks dishes, knocks stuff over. It was some damage in Santa Cruz, broke chimneys. If you were lucky enough to get back to sleep, 1 hour later came another one of equal magnitude. That must have really unnerved people. That must have been really scary. Then the Loma Prieta earthquake, October 17th, 1989. This, you can see where it points to the main shock. All those little red dots there are all the aftershocks. There were thousands of them. A lot of them too small to be felt, but those of you who were here know that there were a lot you could feel, especially right after the earthquake. Earthquakes drop off, aftershocks drop off, decrease over time. This is a showing from October 17th up to about November 8th, and you can see the rather quick drop off of the aftershocks. One of the really interesting things about the Loma Prieta earthquake is that apparently the rupture didn't reach the surface. The focus, the hypocenter of the earthquake, where it originated, was 11.5 miles down. And the fault didn't break all the way to the surface. However, the area south of the fault was uplifted slightly, maybe foot and a half. So how is that possible? Well, when you hold a rock in your hand, it doesn't seem very elastic. That's the last word you think about. But when you got 11 miles of rock, it actually is somewhat elastic. There was a geologist at UCSC back in '89, Bob Anderson, who, based on data he collected, put together this map showing uplift in the Santa Cruz area due to, and also some subsidence due to the earthquake. So let's think about that. Let's just think about that. Now just suppose, for the sake of argument, that you have an earthquake and every 200 years the mountains get pushed up a foot. Doesn't seem like much, but over 1,000 years, that's 5 feet. Now 1,000,000 years is 1,000,000, so now you're up to 5,000 feet of uplift in 1,000,000 years, or 10,000 in 2,000,000 years. Now we don't have 10,000 foot mountains here because erosion is occurring at the same time. But you can see that the numbers work out. You basically can get a pretty good sized mountain range from tiny little amounts of uplift every so often. Now when I gave talks through the years, I used to talk about the gradual uplift over geologic time, spoken like a true geologist. Geologic time. But in human time, you experience the uplift. It's more like an abrupt and violent shock. So it kind of depends on the time scale, whether the uplift is very slow and gradual or very abrupt. Santa Cruz, unfortunately, in 1989 had a lot of old buildings made out of brick put together with lime mortar and also located on river bottom in downtown Santa Cruz, and these are exactly the kind of building that everybody knew would come down in an earthquake, and many of them did. This is the Heen building in downtown Santa Cruz. One wall of that building fell onto the street. Most of the attention of the media and photographers and so forth was focused on the big buildings downtown. But there was a lot of smaller damage all over the place. Holy Cross Church from a distance looked fine, but you zoom in up close and you can see that it was having some problems. There's some cracks down below in the bricks, and ultimately the entire steeple had to be replaced. These condominiums were being constructed right next to where I lived at the time, and nobody had even moved in yet. And these were built to code, but these roof tiles were not fastened down and were not designed to be fastened down. They were designed to just set in place. You know, it was a very low roof angle, and I'm sure everybody thought, well, this is perfectly safe. Well, you can see what happened. They were starting to come off. And had the earthquake shook a lot longer, and the people inside, if they ran outside, you know, they could be badly injured. So I think that's I would classify that as a design flaw. Probably thousands of chimneys were lost. One of the 1868 newspaper articles referred to that earthquake as another chimney tickler. A lot of damage in the local cemeteries. A lot of monuments fell over and are cracked. Even the dead were affected by the Loma Prieta earthquake. So altogether, you know, this is really bad. 13,329 homes damaged just in Santa Cruz County, 774 destroyed. Now, a lot of those that were destroyed were not ones that looked like this. They, from the outside, looked okay. My dentist had a nice home in Santa Cruz, and at first he thought everything was fine. And then some inspectors came around, and they said, this is so badly tweaked that you're going to have to demolish the whole thing and build a new house. A lot of interesting phenomena associated with earthquakes. One of them is liquefaction. If you've ever gone down to the beach and patted on the wet sand and saw it get all kind of liquefied, then you know what liquefaction is. That sort of thing happened during the Loma Prieta earthquake. This was the then fairly new Moss Landing Marine Laboratories in Moss Landing. I'm not sure whose idea it was to build that there. But the marine labs at that time were located on the sand spit in Moss Landing. And you think about it, you got the ocean on one side, you got the slough on the other side. So it's going to have a high water table. And indeed, there was a lot of damage there in 1906. And the marine lab was totally destroyed. Had to move to high ground, and that area has all been cleared. The good part, it's all been cleared, and it's all been revegetated with native dune plants. Also over in the Elkhorn Slough area were some mud volcanoes where water came up with sediment and made these volcano-like structures, which were fascinating. A lot of rock slides along the local cliffs, including a big one right out here at Seabright. This is a picture I took. It's where there's a retaining wall now. We're very fortunate that the earthquake occurred at the end of the summer season rather than at the end of the rainy season. Had the ground been more saturated, liquefaction would have been much worse, and there would have been hundreds of landslides in the Santa Cruz Mountains. A rather interesting phenomenon that was recorded up in the summit area were these fissures that opened up. And at first geologists were looking to see if this was actually a fault rupture, but they were kind of irregular, not a continuous rupture of the San Andreas Fault or some trace of the fault. And they didn't seem to be connected with landslides. And they finally concluded that the violent shaking just cracked the mountaintops. And they started opening up these fissures, which was a phenomenon that really hadn't been observed that much before. So this was something new and made people start to rethink what areas were safe and what areas were not. The San Andreas Fault is the plane of the fault dips at an angle, and because the focus of the earthquake was 11.5 miles down, the epicenter, which is right directly above, wasn't on the fault. It was actually 3 miles away in Nicene Mark State Park. So Nicene Mark State Park, which was a not very well known, not used much state park, except to us locals, suddenly became a tourist destination. Everybody wanted to hike to the epicenter. This is a really interesting phenomenon. Back in 1906, there were 1 or 2 accounts. People said, well, the earthquake was so strong it snapped the tops off of redwood trees. And years later, scientists reading that, there weren't any photographs of this. And they said, that couldn't happen. Well, it happened again with the Loma Prieta earthquake. This is Alice Harper, longtime friend of the museum here, and her husband Dan took this picture. It was like little Christmas trees all over the ground up at Nicene Marks. Corralitos Creek started flowing a lot more, and this is a phenomenon that has been observed with many earthquakes, many different springs and creeks and rivers in coastal California. Here's a description from 1865, that earthquake here in Santa Cruz. We are informed that all the mountain streams immediately after the earthquake commenced rising. Well, you can't predict earthquakes, unfortunately. They're not like hurricanes, where we can give people several days warning so they can get out of the way. There was a period of time, in fact, when I was in college in the 1970s, where people thought, maybe we can predict earthquakes. And there were some Chinese scientists who successfully predicted a big earthquake over in China. Apparently that was a fluke, never replicated. So what the U.S. Geological Survey does, instead of trying to predict an earthquake and give a specific, okay, this is the magnitude, this is the location, this is the date, instead of that, they come up with earthquake forecasts. So, well, we have a such and such percentage of an earthquake of a certain magnitude within a certain span of time for a certain area. And, it's not quite as good, but it's something, and it's a good reminder for people to be prepared who are in those areas. So these are, to forecast an earthquake, it helps if you have a long earthquake history, not 150 or 200 years, but say 1,000 or 2,000 years, so you know about how often you get a major earthquake on a particular fault. Our historical records in California don't go back that far, but geologists are sneaky. There's a way to find out about these older earthquakes. And what was done is they dug trenches across some of the faults in areas that had never been disturbed, and they could find places where there are repeated uplifts with new soil layers created each time. They could map these ancient soil layers, carbon-14 date them, and come up with how many past earthquakes there had been. So this was done for the Hayward Fault, and they discovered that there was an earthquake in 1134. I don't remember that one, but that's what they said. 1317, 1475, 1629, 1725, and of course the one in historic time, 1868. And in fact, they've been able to go back even farther than that, almost 2,000 years. And they found that there's been, on average, an earthquake, major earthquake, every 100 to 200 years on the Hayward Fault. And you can see this first one here, 183 years between the two quakes. But then one between 1629 and 1725, that's only 97 years. The last one was 151 years ago. So this is a pamphlet I picked up at the USGS headquarters in Menlo Park. Great place to visit, by the way. They got all kinds of books and handouts and information and displays. And here you can see an example of their forecasting. And at this time they came up with a 62% probability for one or more magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquakes from 2003 to 2032. So the Hayward Fault, the Hayward earthquake in 1868 did a lot of damage to East Bay towns, but the East Bay was, compared to today, was practically unpopulated. Oakland, San Leandro, Hayward were little tiny towns. This is Oakland, downtown Oakland, 1860. That's Lake Merritt. So we've all been hearing a lot of stories on the news and information about earthquake preparedness. good to be prepared. Have battery-powered radio and flashlights and first aid kits and food and water. Something that doesn't get mentioned very often, although I did hear it, I think last night on the news. It's good not to ever let your gas tank get real low, because if the power is out, you won't be able to get gas, and if you want to get out of here, you want to have enough gas to do that. Also good to have a little cash on hand, because it may not be possible for businesses to take credit cards. So there's lots of things to keep in mind. Make sure you live in a house that is properly prepared for an earthquake, that it's bolted to the foundation, and that the water heater is strapped in place so it won't break loose and rip open a gas line. This house was on Myrtle Street, and that's what happened. The gas line broke and started a fire almost immediately, and it burned all the way to the ground. You'll hear a lot of things about, well, if there's an earthquake, you should do this or you should do that. And my thought is that, if there's an earthquake, the first thing you should do is think about, where you're standing. Take note of what's going on. Are you near something that could fall on you? If so, get out of the way. A friend of ours was buying tickets at the Santa Cruz Travel Agency here on the left on October 17th at 5:04 p.m. And when the earthquake hit, his immediately reaction was to dash outside where it's safe.
Oh, God.
So he ran to the front door. Well, the front door opened in instead of opening out. And while he was fumbling with the door, a ton of bricks landed on the sidewalk right in front. So he was really lucky. Now, there were some old buildings downtown, like the Octagon building, as you can see at the top, built 1882, that survived fine, and that's because they had earthquake retrofits. I did an exhibit in this building, helped with an exhibit a few months before the quake, and the director there at that time told me, don't even think about trying to drill a hole in the wall, because the entire interior was lined with this incredibly hard reinforced concrete, and it worked. The building was completely undamaged. This building at UCSC, the Natural Sciences 2 building, got some cracks in it during the quake, but it was judged to be repairable. However, engineers said it really needed extra bracing, and so if you go up there, you'll see this huge steel braces on the outside of the building, which look a little strange, but just think of them as reminders of the Loma Prieta earthquake. There are a lot of little subtle legacies of the earthquake that some of you who didn't live through the earthquake might not notice at first. This is a restaurant, Britannia Arms, right in Capitola Village. This building was constructed after the earthquake, and I didn't talk to the architect, but I'm convinced that these braces were added because of the earthquake. Also, if you look around Santa Cruz, Live Oak, Watsonville, you'll see a lot of chimneys that look like this. And those are all little reminders of the earthquake. And in fact, I took this picture a couple of days ago out my bathroom window. This is the house next door, so I know the history of this chimney. And this chimney looked okay, but it was apparently cracked. So a few months later, it took a few months because masons were very busy after the earthquake. A few months later, the guy came out and he rebuilt the upper part, and then he put this metal cap and he put this little brace on it. So every time I see that little brace, I think, oh yeah, Loma Prieta earthquake. My grandmother used to come to visit Santa Cruz, in the 1960s when I was a little kid. And I remember on one of the visits, she lived up in Oakland. On one of the visits, that's her in the upper left, one of the visits we had a little earthquake. And I was a kid and I didn't think about it. Okay, a little earthquake. Oh, it shook a little, okay. She was very nervous about that earthquake. And it wasn't until after I lived through the 1989 earthquake and thought back about that, she had lived through the 1906 earthquake. And for the rest of her life, 60 years later, that was still on her mind. She was still, earthquake, all right, is this going to be another big one? And so that affected her. My mother said that she told her that in 1906, the earthquake knocked a loaded chest of drawers clear across her bedroom. And she had my uncle and was pregnant as a little baby and was pregnant with my dad. So I don't know how she did it. This is my office at home. My home office. So we built our house about the time of the quake, and there's a little hallway goes into my office, and it has 9-foot ceilings, and these bookshelves go clear to the ceiling. So I put these little chains across, and for 30 years now, every time I want a book, I unhook the chain, I take the book out, and I put the chain back. And it's kind of a hassle. I love books, but I don't want to be buried alive by them. You notice that brown one up on that top that's about 3 inches thick? That's the Lawson report on the 1906 earthquake, and I especially don't want to get hit by that one. It would just be too ironic. Well, a couple of years after the earthquake, the city decided, well, since the downtown's a mess anyway and all these buildings are gone, we should redo all the infrastructure under Pacific Avenue. And I thought, this is never going to happen again. This is a historic. So I went down there with my daughters, Sierra and Adrian, and we posed for some pictures. This is the Logos building on the left, which was the first building to be rebuilt after the earthquake. And just for fun, a couple of months ago, we went back and retook some of the pictures. So this was the Leask's department store on the left, this big hole, later Gottschalk's, with all the reinforcements. That's the facade of the old county bank building. You can see the octagon, you can see what's the former jail, now the McPherson Center. And on the far right in the distance is the Neary building, which is another old building, but had had an earthquake retrofit and therefore came out fine. Mm-hmm. This is the parking garage on the corner of Church and Cedar Street. And now there's a big building in the way, so you don't get that view anymore. Well, after the earthquake, there were people who said, it's going to take several years to rebuild. And I said, are you kidding? It's going to take 10 years to rebuild. Well, here it is, 30 years, and they're just finishing up the last building. In researching this talk, I was looking through the Sentinel around the time of the 1860 earthquake, and I found this quote, and I just had to share it with you. People in California must remember the part of the hemisphere they inhabit. Build against the shakings of the earth as well as against fire. And when an earthquake comes, not to quake in their boots, but look upon it as a natural result. Now, if only people had followed that advice for the next 150 years. But a pretty remarkable statement. They really hit the nail on the head there. Even mentioned fires. How about that? So I'd like to thank all the different people whose images I used for this talk. And before I conclude, I have a short video to show you. For about 5 years now, I've been interviewing people for the Capitola Historical Museum. We call it the Capitola Memories Project. And each person I interviewed, I asked them, do you have an earthquake story? And for the anniversary, we snipped out all those little earthquake stories, and I put them together. It runs 9 minutes, but I think you'll enjoy some of the stories.
Last 5.
Very strong and is fighting with us for second place.
Interestingly, I was at a meeting about traffic and parking with my brother, Nels Westman, in Jim Redding's office, which is at the superintendent's building on Capitola Avenue, which is, as you know, a 3-story wooden structure. And we were sitting in his office, and the earthquake started. And of course, if you've lived in California your whole life, you know the instant it's an earthquake. And I just bolted out of there, and he has a very narrow stairway down to the ground floor. I just flew down that stairway and headed for my businesses, because both stores were open at the time. My daughter was in one, and then I had an employee in the big store. And Jim Redding, till his very last breath, would always say whenever he saw me, I had no idea you could run that fast. Because they were behind me, and I was gone. So I ran down to my business, and it was just a mess. Broken windows, broken pottery, but nobody was hurt. My husband was at De La Viega putting on the practice green during the earthquake, and he said that was an amazing experience because it started, and he's from the East Coast, so he wasn't really as sure of what it was, but he said all of a sudden golf balls were falling out of all the trees. And the windows, you know, that second-story clubhouse at De La Viega, all the windows were breaking and people were rushing out. And the other man that was on the practice tee with him said, do you think this is the big one? And my husband said, seems pretty big to me. And you know.
I was coming home from PG&E. I got off at 5 o'clock. I was working 2 shifts or two different jobs at PG&E. Driving home in my PG&E truck, and I can remember I was going by the radio towers on the East Cliff Drive side of the lagoon there, and as I was starting to climb the hill, I said, what's wrong with my truck, not realizing it was the ground moving. And then I looked up at the power poles, and at the end of the shock, it was like the biggest snap, like somebody hit a bullwhip on those wires on top of the pole. They just become taut and then slack. And as I looked ahead towards the 26th Avenue beach and up towards the 30s and all the way up to 41st Avenue, because I continued home in my PG&E truck. At 41st Avenue, you couldn't see the road for the amount of dirt that had fallen down into the ocean and the cloud of brown dust, for lack of a better thing.
Stop. Oh, there was a funny story about my daughter's fish. She had a pet fish named Jenny, and she had won it in 2nd grade by throwing the balls into the little goldfish bowl with a goldfish in it that's this big. Okay, so she won the goldfish, and she named it Jenny. Well, as goldfish do, because they're a carp, it kept growing and growing and growing. We kept getting bigger and bigger bowls, and finally I ended up with this huge aquarium upstairs. She kept it in her bedroom, and she loved it. She'd talk to it, and she'd, Jenny, Jenny. They would come up to eat. So the fish was like probably maybe this big. And so we came home. They had been swimming at Jim Booth's swim school, and I was driving them home, and I felt this jerking. I thought my transmission fell out. I stopped the car and looked, and I saw everybody stop looking under their car and looking at their car, thinking something had terribly happened. So we got home, and Mary runs upstairs right away to see if Jenny's okay, and Jenny was on the floor, dead, and she screams, "Mom, Mom, Jenny's dead," you know, she's on the floor. And we picked her up, and we put her back in the aquarium, and she came back to life.
Oh, that's good.
She had been out of the water for like 20 minutes.
I went down to walked down on the highway where the highway patrol had the road blocked off, and Highway 17 blocked off, and who comes driving up but our city public works director in a city car, and so I jumped in with him and came back over the hill with him.
Oh.
Got home, and it was very eerie coming down past Pasatiempo. As you come in, you can see Santa Cruz down there. It was totally black, no lights at all, with a couple of helicopters with those big spotlights flying over. Very, very eerie. And
so we were all terrified to go back in our houses, and we all camped out on the Lynn's lawn. Everybody took out the food from the freezers. We barbecued everything. Well, we laid on the ground, and it was the strangest sensation because it was like laying on Jell-O. It just kept kind of like, it would move slightly. You'd feel that little movement. It was the weirdest thing. It was just like, oh my gosh.
But the house was such a mess. The refrigerator had danced through the middle of the kitchen, and it had opened and shut its shelves so that the freezer food in the top had bounced out and bounced back into the bottom. And the rice had hit the floor with the soy sauce. I tell you, we had a big mess.
Set up tents and slept on the front lawn for, I think, about a week and a half before we would actually sleep back in the house, because by then the aftershocks were starting to subside. But sleeping on the creek was kind of interesting because the ducks would know that the earthquake was coming before we did. So if we were sleeping right next to the river, and all of a sudden all the birds in the middle of the night would start, being all agitated, and we'd be like, okay, here comes one, and then along would come the aftershock.
I was mayor at that time, and I can't remember where I had gone, but my wife Kay got in touch with me, and she said the FBI is looking for you. And I thought, okay, do I go home or do I run? So what they wanted to do was vet me to go into Santa Cruz to look at the damage with the president. And so I did come home and meet with the FBI, and they made sure I was who I said I was. And then in the earthquake book that was published about a year or so later, I'm about 4 people back from the president walking down the street in Santa Cruz.
No generators. We could not publish for a couple of days. And the San Jose Mercury was in competition with the Sentinel, but they called us and offered to help, and we were able to put out a newspaper. We had switched from afternoon to mornings, and when they offered to help, why then we had to print around their schedule. So we went back to being an afternoon paper for a couple of days.
Oh.
And when we finally were able to get a paper out, Marty Douglas Browning was the circulation manager, and she was there, and we had like 200 people in front of the store, in front of the office building, waiting for a newspaper, and we went out and gave them some papers. We didn't sell them; we just handed them newspapers. They wanted
People
to know
were
what
hungry
was going
for
on.
news. Yeah.